I'm Alan Wolfe, and I'm the director of the Boisi Center, and I'm extremely excited about the program you're about to hear. I always wanted to do something on this issue because it seems to me that writing about religion is, well, one way of putting it, you'll notice by appearance how young our commentators are, especially compared to the moderator. And that to me says, first thing about why this is so interesting, it's very, very difficult to have had a long career in writing about religion. 20, 25 years ago, newspapers, well, to the extent that they covered religion in most of our newspapers, it was on a Saturday. And it was basically just a list of which sermons would be preached at which churches in the area. The notion that one could bring to journalism expertise in the subject, well, obviously you could be an expert in foreign policy or so on, but experts in religion just weren't found in the media. I have to say, same is true of my academic discipline, political science, which had no real specialization in religion either 25 years ago. Now the study of religion and politics is one of the booming fields in the American Political Science Association, and the subject of religion and journalism and the interest that journalists show in religion is booming as well. So it's a great time to talk about this, but it's especially gratifying to have easily the three best practitioners in the country who write on this subject. And the fact that they were the first three people we invited, and that they all said yes right away is just enormously gratifying. So we have on the far end here, Rod Dreher, who's a writer, editor, and blogger, especially for the American Conservative. And if you don't know the American Conservative, it is an absolutely astonishingly good publication. It's a representative of what I, for lack of a better term, call real conservatism, the genuine thing, not necessarily and not even at all an apologist for one side in the culture war or for one political party over the other, but a serious effort to resurrect conservatism as a way of thinking about the world that has a significant internal coherence and really represents, in my view, an extremely admirable outlook on the events of the day. Rod is living in his hometown now in Louisiana. He's written enormously and blogs extensively. The thing that I like most is a book he wrote called Crunchy Cons about the alternative or counterculture movement among younger conservatives. And I guess you are a Crunchy Con? Or?
I do my best.
You do your best, right. And Mark Oppenheimer is next to him. Mark writes the beliefs columns in the New York Times, and to our great fortune is also a visiting professor here at Boston College, where he holds the Corcoran Visiting Chair in Christian-Jewish Relations. He writes on an enormous number of subjects as well, and is also the author of Knocking on Heaven's Door, American Religion in the Age of the Counterculture, and a book, 13 in a Day, The Bar and Bat Mitzvah. He's also teaches English at Yale and in the Divinity School at Yale. And while he's here at Boston College, he's completing research on Judeo-Christian interpretations of family law, specifically with regard to marriage and divorce. I've met Mark and Rod before. I'd never met Sarah Posner before, so it's especially delightful to meet her. She's an investigative journalist and author, writing frequently on these subjects. She's a regular contributor on religion to Al Jazeera America and Religion Dispatches. She's written in just an enormous number of publications. She's the author of God's Prophet, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Values Voters, constantly appearing on television. As I mentioned to her on the way over here, I have my own favorite blogger about politics. He's from Georgia. His name's Ed Kilgore, and he often talks about Sarah's work. And just today, in fact, he was praising one of her recent articles. If you really want to follow this stuff, these are the three people you really follow. So what we're going to do is have a short introduction from each, and then I'll ask questions, you ask questions, and we'll listen and be enlightened. Rod, would you like to start?
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for that very generous introduction. I'm one of the few people, I think, who makes his living at blogging. It's what I love to do. Fish got to swim, I got to write and blog. On the blog that I write for the American Conservative, I write about a lot of different things, but as I was thinking about what to say at this event, I was thinking, now, what issue is it that is the most difficult to talk about from a religious point of view in a polarized world? And there's really no contest. It's homosexuality. No issue I ever write about on my blog gets more attention from readers. I can write about war, I can write about the economy, I can write about anything, and you'll get maybe 20, 30 comments. I write about homosexuality, routinely 150, 200 comments, because people, for whatever reason, this is a thing that they really care about, and they're very passionate, and they just can't seem to see what the other side is saying so often. In fact, I had a situation a few years ago when some of my readers were saying, you're blogging obsessively about this issue, and this was maybe 2009, 2010. It's been a big issue for 10 years. I said, well, maybe I am doing too much. I went back and looked at and did a survey of all the things I'd written in the past year, and it turned out that gay issues only accounted for maybe 8, 10, 11% of my entire output. But because there was so much heat around these issues, the perception among my readers was I was blogging about it constantly. I think that says something about our national conversation about religion and morality. I think it's, from my perspective as an Orthodox Christian, and I say Orthodox instead of conservative because I'm not a Republican, I'm a registered independent, and I hate the way religious categories become conflated with political categories. I don't think that's accurate and helps us understand how religious people think. But from a religious perspective, I think there's no issue that's harder to talk about and harder for liberals to understand than the Orthodox point of view on sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular. In my experience, the overwhelming majority of progressive commentators assume that the only reason conservatives could possibly have arrived at their conclusions on the issue is from bigotry, straight up. It doesn't help that people on my side of the issue, we can't articulate our views very well. We haven't been able to in the past. But it's discouraging when the dialogue across the religious divide begins with the Orthodox feeling as if we have to prove from the very beginning that we aren't haters in order to be listened to. I think more substantively, it becomes very difficult to communicate across that divide when so few of our interlocutors appear to understand, or at least from an Orthodox point of view, what religion is and what it does, or what it traditionally has done. To be very general about it, religious liberals tend to treat religion as something man says about God in man's experience of the divine. Religious conservatives, again generalizing, see religion as primarily what God says to man about God's truth. Of course, these things aren't absolute, and both religious liberals and religious conservatives do both things, but I'm speaking very generally. I find that progressives have a very difficult time understanding that Orthodox believers believe that we are not as free to change on given issues or doctrines as they are. In my sense, and you guys may wish to challenge me on this, to the progressives, religion changes to suit our changing times and changing needs in society. Well, to the Orthodox, religion stands outside of time and culture, and we humans have to conform our understanding and behavior to its principles. Again, these aren't cut and dried categories or ways of seeing things, but these are just general tendencies. The result I see is that progressives often find it impossible to make sense of why religiously Orthodox people reason as we do about sexuality. For them, the truth claims of religion are far more malleable than they are for the Orthodox. I found it really interesting that the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who's one of my favorite writers, has found that moral conservatives typically understand the liberal viewpoint far better than liberals understand the conservative viewpoint. Anecdotally, I found that to be true. Finally, I think there are a couple of very broad issues that condition the environment in which religion writing and religious communication takes place. First of all, I think that our country is an increasingly illiterate culture when it comes to religion. One of the concepts I like to talk about all the time is called moralistic therapeutic deism. It was a term invented by Christian Smith, the Notre Dame sociologist of religion, who studied the religious viewpoints or religious opinions of American youth. And he said that de facto religion in America, cutting across Christian, Jewish, and Islamic lines, is moralistic therapeutic deism. That is the idea that all religion is about is God is up there in his heaven, he wants us to be nice, and we really only have to bother him when we want something, and good people go to heaven and everybody's good but Hitler. That, as far as Smith was able to find, is basically what Americans believe. That sort of religion can be fitted easily into the sort of bourgeois consumer worldview on both the right and the left. And we no longer in this country are increasingly, we don't think that religion ought to speak prophetically. We don't understand religions that do. Secondly, in journalism and media, there's a default mode to secular liberalism, at the heart of which is individualism and choice. It's hard for religiously orthodox people to be heard in an environment in which the conversation is framed by the assumptions of secular liberalism. And by liberalism, I don't mean the Democratic Party. I mean liberalism in the sense that we're all liberal, 19th century classical liberalism. Justice Anthony Kennedy's statement in the Casey ruling that the heart of liberty is the ability to define reality for oneself. He said something close to that, but I think that is true. It's a description of how most Americans think about religion, and certainly among the professional classes in academia, the legal world, and in journalism. But to a religiously orthodox person, that is a highly problematic claim, and by no means a neutral one. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's difficult to have this conversation in part because the grounds and the language on which we have it do not favor the orthodox point of view, and it's difficult because some of these issues, especially around homosexuality, which I think is the most contentious issue we have in public life today among the religious, I think people are so emotional about it, and it becomes very hard to talk past the emotion.
Well, all right.
That's what I say.
It's very good to be here. I've been reading Rod and Sarah for years without having met them, and now I'm meeting them. And apparently we're being live streamed, so I want to say to all the people watching the live stream, hello. I would like to focus a little bit more on, so we're here to talk about writing and about religion in a polarized age. I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about the writing, though I may glance on the religion. And I'm always happy to talk about gay issues, which I've written a lot about. I actually discovered who the first openly gay Protestant minister was. That was in graduate school. And I thought that would make me famous. And it turned out no one cared. But if you want to ask me a question about that later, I'm happy to talk about that. Part of the reason nobody cared is because he was Unitarian. And, Unitarians don't make waves. So I'm going to freestyle a little bit and start with a response to something you said before going into my sketchily prepared remarks. You said that journalism defaults to secular liberalism. Maybe you mean the journalists who write it are largely secular liberals, and if that's what you were asserting, you're no doubt correct. I think journalism as a practice defaults to a kind of Enlightenment empiricism, which is we're supposed to work from evidence. And in my experience, most journalists I know bend over with multiple backflips to accept religious claims that, while they might be true, certainly aren't true on the Enlightenment-grounded empirical evidence in the way that, the fact that the meteorological report is true. And most people who write about religion suffer from a surfeit of empathy, compassion, and goodwill towards the claims of religious people and to religious people themselves, in part because they're terrified of getting things wrong because they themselves are secular liberals. So the problem with coverage of religion is not that it's too critical, but that it's way too soft, and that most religion writers are still stuck in the mode that Alan talked about of the old the Saturday Church page, which was a feature of the ladies page where you could also read hints from Heloise and some Dear Abby, and then find out who the new preacher was who was giving the guest sermon at the Presbyterian Church on Sunday. And that's why they always ran on Saturday. And we are still not at the place we need to be as writers, where we take it as our job to be skeptical and hard-hitting and pay religion the courtesy of doing real reporting on it. And if you don't believe me, I defy you to go do a survey of religion writing across most of America and find out how interested the editors are in assigning their religion reporters to uncover financial corruption in the local churches. Or to even do some easy, fun, quick hits, like write about how much the pastor's new car cost, or what property taxes he or she paid on his or her house. The easy stuff to shame people who live on the nonprofit dole, as religious leaders do. By the way, this includes some of my favorite people. I'm the membership chairman of my synagogue, and I love our rabbi, and Rod knows I'm probably more obsessed with the lives of and teachings of Orthodox Christians than most conservative Jews you'll ever find. But the fact is, if we care about these people and take them seriously as fellow intellectuals, we are woefully inadequate in reporting on them. So I think that perhaps I'm misreading what you were saying, but if I'm reading it correctly, you're completely wrong. So
No, I'll wait.
You'll get back to it. Okay. So now, that said, here was the gesture I was going to make to start, which was to just tell a story about what happened when I took over the Times Religion column about 5 years ago from the great Catholic columnist Peter Steinfels. After I'd written about 4 or 5 columns, one of which was about the deeply dishonest Catholic political operative Mark Thiessen, who thinks that Catholic theology somehow recommends torture. Another of which was about a video game based on Dante's Inferno. Another of which was about, I don't even remember, but it was a mix of relatively critical and hard-hitting stuff, some lightweight stuff, some fun stuff. It was what a columnist, I think, should do, which is mix it up for his or her readers, right? I got a letter from a reader who said, I miss the old columnist. And by the way, I think that in what follows, I should say, I think that this reader deeply misread what Steinfels had done with his column and was damning him with all sorts of faint praise coming from him. I think Steinfels was a much better and more complicated columnist than this fellow wanted him to be. But my correspondent wrote, I miss the old column. The old column was a safe space in the newspaper where religious people could go to feel that they were talking with someone who got them. And you treat religion like this curiosity that's meant to be investigated. And I wrote back and I said, well, I don't think that's what Steinfels did, first of all. But to the extent that any writer does, that seems to me entirely professionally derelict as a columnist. We're not supposed to create safe spaces for anybody. Indeed, the best advice columnists don't create safe spaces. You read a good advice columnist, they're just comforting their readers all the time. There is no space in the paper that's safe. And we went back and forth. And somewhere in the correspondence, I said, I think I have the right metaphor, because I had not deeply theorized my calling at that point. They offered me a column, it paid, I said, sure. But I hit on, this guy pushed me, and I hit on what it was that I was doing. I said, hey, pal, I don't think that as a let's say, a Chicago Cubs fan, you expect that the Chicago Cubs reporter is supposed to just say cheery things about the Cubs all the time. In fact, the great sport of being a fan of a losing team is that you're constantly reading honest and ruthless appraisals of the inadequacies of the team. And that's what it means to be a fan. And I said, why don't you think of what I do as what a sports writer does? Which is obviously the fact that attention is being devoted to the enterprise suggests a certain basic respect, right? We don't have columns about, dog grooming or, entomology or whatever, though maybe we should. But look, there's obviously a basic respect. If I'm writing a religion column, it's because I care about religion and think of it as an important enterprise, human or divine. But just like the sports columnist cares about sports, she is still obligated to talk about steroid abuse or inadequate front office management. I mean, that's what it is to do the work, right? And he didn't buy it. But I've carried that with me ever since, and I'm sort of grateful to whoever that person was who's receded from my memory and orphaned on my old Yahoo account. And I think he pushed me to think about what it is that we do, and I think that we do have to be engaged, but I think we're engaged in the way that we also want to point out the steroid abuse.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. This is great, and enjoyed listening to what the two of you had to say. And maybe we'll interrogate some of the stuff that you said about what secular or liberal or progressive journalists think about Orthodox Christians and what they believe about homosexuality. But I was going to talk a little bit about when I thought about writing about religion in a polarized age, it made me think about some of the topics that I've covered very intensely over the past 3 or so years, and how, as a journalist, you approach these things that are very polarized, either within a particular religious community or between a religious community and the secular world, or between a religious community and perhaps another religious community. The first example is the religious exemptions to laws, and those religious exemptions can include the exemption for religious institutions from the contraception coverage requirement in the Affordable Care Act, which led to the Hobby Lobby case, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, or exemptions for religious institutions from same-sex marriage laws, something that is in the news a lot now. Rod has written about this in light of the growing legalization of same-sex marriage in various states, and coming up against the claims of business owners who say that they want to be exempted from having to perform wedding ceremonies or be exempted from providing services to same-sex couples, whether it's catering or photography or the like. These issues are incredibly contentious. I'm sure you've all read about them. I'm sure you've all thought about them. And reporting on them is extremely challenging because as a religion reporter, I am deeply committed to respecting the religious beliefs of people who make religious claims. Yet as a reporter of politics, and this is getting to that intersection that you're talking about, as a reporter on politics, I'm always mindful of how religion may be used by political actors or political elites or religious leaders acting in the political sphere to advance a political agenda. And that is one of the incredibly challenging things of reporting on this particular intersection of religion and politics, because you want to give credence to religious claims and the First Amendment rights of individuals, now I guess RFRA rights of corporations as well. Yet you want to recognize the impact of making those claims and getting those exemptions on other people who may not share the same religious tradition, or who may even share the same religious tradition but don't interpret it the same way. So, for example, in the contraception instance, there are plenty of Catholics who don't object to the use of contraception and also didn't object to the coverage requirement under the Affordable Care Act. So navigating all of those things as a reporter is always, it's a treacherous place, but it's a place where I think you have to find a place of, honestly reflecting everybody's side in this, but not just giving religion, saying, okay, well, this is your religious belief, so this is fine, and regardless of the impact on society as a whole or what the role of government is in regulating things. So that was one area where I've spent a lot of time reporting in the past few years. Another is Islamophobia, which is another odd place for the intersection of religion and politics, because there are claims being made by people who are not of that religious faith, who are not Muslim, making claims about what Islam is. So when people are exhibiting Islamophobia in the public square, they might say something like, well, Islam is an inherently violent religion. That's why we have ISIS. That's why we have terrorism. And it's such a fraught thing to report on, because people who make those claims typically do not understand Islam, or not listening to people who are Muslim and do practice Islam and have read the texts and understand the tradition and understand the historical context in which the religious texts were written, and can explain why some texts that sound like they might be endorsing violence are not in fact endorsing violence, except perhaps defensive war. And then the third area, which might be the most fraught of all. In the past few months, particularly around the time of the war in Gaza this summer, I was reporting on polarization within the Jewish community on issues relating to Israel. And I guess if I thought that the religious exemptions was a fraught topic, it had nothing on reporting on this. Because within the Jewish community, there is a lot of disagreement about what constitutes being pro-Israel, what the role or goal of the peace process should be, whether the occupation should continue or not continue, what the settlement, whether the settlements should continue or not continue, and then so that's the right-left polarization, and at the same time, even within from like say the center left within the American Jewish community, there in that space between the center and the left, there is a great deal of polarization, and I would say increasing polarization since this summer's events. Interrogating those claims requires understanding what the actual history of Israel and Palestine and the occupied territories is, having skepticism about claims people make on both sides, on the right and the left. It's such a contentious topic, and I think that few journalists even want to go there because it is so contentious. But I think that you can't shy away from it because it's so contentious. You can't shy away from it for the hate mail that you might get. And in fact, I wrote a piece this summer about polarization in the center left of the American Jewish community. And as soon as my editor published it, I was kind of cringing, thinking, what kind of email am I going to get about this piece? And I actually got the most email I've ever gotten on any piece I've ever written. And to a person, everybody said, thank you for writing that. Everybody is afraid to say that. So sometimes with polarization, it's good to just put yourself out there and put yourself in the polarized place, because it might start a conversation that people actually want to have.
Thank you all. My role here is really to provoke questions, and so many issues have been raised. Three of the hottest topics that we're dealing with at the moment, homosexuality and Islamophobia and the Middle East, certainly would provide, we could spend the whole time on any one of them. I'd like to hope that we can address all of them, and then anything else that's on your mind. But since you guys have already started a little discussion about the subject that Rod brought up about writing about homosexuality, I find the most impolite way I can to fuel that discussion by saying that, Rod, you never actually told us anything about your views about homosexuality in your talk. And now that could be because you believe that they're private and that we shouldn't hear them. And if that's the case, I fully respect that. Or it could reflect the very difficulty that your talk was addressed to, that we just have. I'll have a hard time talking about it.
Well, yeah, well, my views are the Orthodox Christian views. I believe that the only sexual activity that is illicit is within a traditional opposite-sex marriage. But the point is, I want to talk about journalism here, not debate this very contentious issue. I think Mark hit something really important, though, when he said that, talking about the difference between writing from a reporting point of view, and I think you're absolutely right. There's too much timidity on religious staffs, or the staff of religion writers, a few there are left, and in newsrooms. I've seen it myself. But I realized as you were talking, I'm writing it from the opinion side. I've always been an opinion journalist and an opinion editor, and so we're looking at two very different kinds of journalism there. When you were talking, Sarah, about Islamophobia, I immediately remembered a very unpleasant experience I had when I was on the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News, which had broken some important news about Islamic terror fundraising in Dallas. I began looking into this more deeply and found that one of the big mosques in Dallas, they were preaching some pretty radical things there, and I found sermons online, and this was objective proof of it, and I started writing about it, and immediately I became the target of a hate campaign from within the local Muslim community. They were trying to get me fired for writing about this, and I would call the imam and ask his opinion on it, and he wouldn't talk to me. I said, why won't you talk to me? Well, you're not going to be fair. Well, how can I be fair if you're not going to give me your opinion? Well, you see? I mean, it just on and on and on like that. And it was so difficult because I really was trying to be as fair as I could, but as you say, Mark, so many people, Muslims, Catholics, Jews, others, they only want happy news about their religion. They're happy to see a newspaper or a magazine report critically on the other guy. But when it comes to their own religion, it's much different. I saw this as a Catholic. When I'm an ex-Catholic. I lost my faith primarily as a result of having reported on the abuse scandal. I think that being a Catholic at the time and reporting on the scandal gave me such a certain amount of insight that just wasn't there for someone who wasn't within the religion himself or herself. But what it also did is the practice of journalism and trying to do the journalistically responsible thing really tore my faith apart. And I think you probably all read or heard of William Lobdell's book from the LA Times about how he lost his faith in Christianity, covering scandals. And so I'll just leave it at that, but I want to say that I agree with you that there's too much timidity in newsrooms about covering religion. It ought to be covered from a tough point of view. And I was just talking about from a blogging and from an opinion point of view that it seems that there's a lot of heat and little light because there's so much, from what I see on my blog and in the blogs I read, there's so much of an assumption of bad faith on the other side. It's hard to find common ground.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that, right, when you read progressive or liberal opinion writers on religion who themselves are not familiar with what more orthodox interpretations of religion look like, it is sometimes flabbergasting how crudely they oversimplify and the kinds of mistakes that they make. And you do have to wonder if it's just that they don't know anyone or ever have a conversation about, or don't have anyone they can show it to, where they say, hey, you're an Orthodox Christian or you're a religious Jew or Muslim or whatever. Am I getting inside the mindset of someone who takes, who views Scripture in this way or reads it as making these kinds of claims on my behavior, or am I not? And it is very troubling. So I think that, I think that if I were talking about opinion writing, I would probably agree with you there.
But I think the difficult thing with talking about issues around sexuality and LGBT rights is that same intersection that I was talking about, that, you have your beliefs about homosexuality, yet, where is that place where your beliefs can impact the rights of somebody else when their rights aren't impacting your rights, right? So when you have a same-sex marriage law that exempts ministers and other clergy from having to perform wedding ceremonies for same-sex couples, so is that sufficient protection for both parties involved? Is it sufficient protection for the gay couple that wants to get married and sufficient protection for the religious actor who doesn't want to have to be involved in performing that ceremony? And I think it's that place where the conversation, I agree with you that the conversation can be very contentious and polarizing when somebody's just like, oh, well, your beliefs make you a bigot, end of story. But even what I'm talking about can be very contentious, but I think solvable, right? And so, I think that the solution that many of the states that have enacted the same-sex marriage laws, instead of their bans being overturned by a court, or same-sex marriage being instituted by a court, they have those exemptions. And to me, those exemptions solve a problem that, well, it's not a problem I have, but it's a problem you're identifying. So, I think that to have the conversation in that place is much more productive. You're talking about not finding common ground, but I think that's an area of conversation where that can be found.
But could I just say, again, I think you're engaging a dialogue with Rod also as someone who writes, I don't think of you as an opinion writer, but I think the problem you're discussing is an opinion writer's problem. And I want to be clear with the people who may be in the audience who might want to be reporters that like finding common ground with your readers is not an interesting question if you're a reporter.
Right.
It's not up to you to find common ground. What's up to you is to write clearly and carefully in a way that tells them true things about an important issue. And oftentimes that will mean presenting facts to religious people who feel, but these facts don't comport with my worldview in some way, or they don't support what I, and oh well, too bad. It will often times involve presenting facts to secular readers who then wish that you'd given all sorts of damning context to the facts because, I wrote a piece Sunday in the New York Times Magazine about the culture of generosity in an ultra-Orthodox town of Lakewood, New Jersey. And it would be a correct inference of the piece that oftentimes very, very religious people give away more of their money than secular liberals do. In fact, we know that they do. That's not a contentious, it's not universally true. There are exceptions all over the place, but it's not for nothing that Utah has the highest rate of charitable giving in the country. A lot of that money goes straight to their church, and you could then argue is what the church does with it, charitable or not. But on many, many metrics, religious people are very, very generous. Sometimes you're telling that to secular readers who don't want to hear it, but oh well. So I guess what I'm saying, I'm arguing in terms of doing my job for a certain lack of interest in what the reader thinks. I don't spend a lot of time, and I don't read many of the comments, which again is that's not a blog. I think bloggers don't have that luxury. I think bloggers have to engage their readers.
Bloggers don't
Yeah.
have to read the comments.
No, I curate mine because it's been very important to me for the years I've been doing my blog to make it a safe place for people, whatever their religious or political beliefs, to have this dialogue. And my readers, about half my readers on the American Conservative are liberals, openly arguing for liberal
I think
positions.
the American Conservative is probably the most read conservative magazine by liberals, I would guess.
Well, it may be, and that's a dubious distinction with our audience, but nevertheless, I like that because I don't want to be in the amen corner where people saying, yeah, good for you, stick it to the liberals, because I was wrong about the Iraq War. I was wrong about a lot of things, and I really got shaken up by how do we know what we know? And so over the last decade, I've become a lot more interested in what the other side says, not because, I lack confidence in my own opinion, but because I want to know if I'm wrong. And I only know if I'm wrong if I listen to what the other side says. So I've tried to curate my blog section, my comment section, where people can have that civil discussion. But I think most bloggers don't do that because you don't really have the time to do that.
I have a question that it's sort of about Islamophobia, but I think it's a more general question. As Rod, you rightly reminded us, we're here to talk about writing about religion. We had a fascinating laboratory experiment the last 24 hours about reporting. I've never seen anything quite like it. We had a killing in Ottawa. It was covered by a government-run, not completely government-paid for it. There are commercials on the Canadian broadcasting, but it's basically like our public television. And the discussion of what happened, by everything I've read about it, was calm, no excitement, factual, and short. It didn't go on all day, 24 hours. And in this country, we had coverage of Ebola, and it was 24 hours and was borderline hysterical, and so on. Now, it sounds like I'm condemning the American version and praising the Canadian, but I'm not actually. I think it's a real interesting question, which one is better? Because one is cool and essentially disengaged, and the other at least gets people excited. And so I throw it out. Which kind of coverage on a topic like when someone of Islamic faith kills somebody somewhere, which kind of coverage is best for us as citizens?
Well, I thought that the coverage of what happened in Canada was, very, like you said, very even keel. But I thought that it was good that they did not jump to a conclusion that even though this individual who committed this crime, this terrorist act, had converted to Islam, there wasn't really any evidence that he was acting in concert with anybody else. I mean, he had read jihadi materials, or there was evidence that he had posted stuff on his Facebook or whatever it was. But there wasn't any evidence that he was acting in cahoots with anyone else or that there were any accomplices. And so I think that the relationship between a possible, widespread terrorist problem in Canada and him was pretty thin. Like lone wolf was, I think, the word that the Canadian authorities used.
But Fox News wouldn't have treated that.
No, and I think the way Canada dealt with it was much better because you don't want to overstate this, right? Because if you had, a Timothy McVeigh, you don't want to, was he representative of other people who practice the same faith he did? Not really. So, I think it's more akin to something like that than it is to, 9/11.
Does anyone want to defend it?
I've remained generally ignorant of what happened yesterday, and then I like to catch up with my news a few days later. So
No, I mean,
I mean, I know what happened, but I don't pay close. One of the luxuries of writing biweekly and not having a blog is I don't pay close attention to the. I figure we'll know more in 4 or 5 days. I mean, I figure probably most of what we think we know right now will be shown in some regards to be wrong. So, that's the problem with 24-hour news channels is we think that, oh, it's 9 hours have passed. We're so far ahead of where we were at 3 hours. But in truth,
So then respond to the Ebola treatment and coverage.
well, no, I mean, I think that's right. I'm more like you, Mark. I left Philadelphia 3 years ago, and I live in the country in South Louisiana now. I don't have a TV. I get my news from reading newspapers online. And when I go see my mom and dad, they have cable TV on, and they're watching cable news, and it is amazing how anxious I get. Whatever the story is, just that constant pow, 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 it would scare you to death. And I feel like that's a false view of the world. I mean, I don't believe that newspapers should try to calm people necessarily. If there's a real threat, there should be a threat. But I find it so much easier and informative to get my news through the coolness of print than television. And if I still had cable TV, you better believe I would be watching if there's a shooting in Canada. But I've gotten it through reading the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, and others, and I frankly feel better informed, and I'm not so alarmed. That's what they do. They exist to alarm people. And it's Fox and it's CNN, it's all of them. That's the nature of the game.
Well, then turning it back to the American coverage of Ebola, you think, I assume then you would grade the American coverage poorly in terms of informing the citizenry and doing a real disservice. This is certainly, at least the blogs I read, this is just what I hear constantly.
But Alan, one thing that I agree with you that the coverage was overheated, but when you had the CDC and the hospital in Dallas giving false information, it turned out it wasn't what they said. You can understand why people got upset.
I thought that the coverage of the Dallas hospital's mistakes and errors was important because it was important that those mistakes not be replicated by anybody else. But I think that the overwrought, I noticed in the airport today, there was cable news that were calling it an Ebola outbreak, and I don't think outbreak is really the right term to use for what has happened in the United States. And, there's a certain lack of empathy for what has happened in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea.
maybe some of you got the thing I got on my Facebook feed, the little meme or poster that said, more Americans have been married to Kim Kardashian than have died of Ebola.
What did you guys think of the coverage of the Synod? Because that was an example of the Synod of the Family in Rome recently. I found, generally speaking, coverage of these issues of the Catholic Church really from the American media, lacks a lot of nuance. I mean, Pope Francis can talk all day about the poor, and it's maybe barely a headline in the newspaper, and doesn't even make TV. But when it comes to issues that interest Americans, sex, well, then it's we go to town on it. On the other hand, there were some real problems. There were real problems with the way the Catholic Church in Rome, the way that they released information to the media. And I believe some of the blogs I read, John Allen, who's one of my favorite religion reporters, I think he talked about this too. It was a bungled job from Rome in presenting the information to the reporters, and the media actually pointed out some real problems with it.
I think that one of the things that coverage of anything Vatican always highlights is how uninterested most reporters and most Americans are in theology, because what they're doing over there is theology. I mean, they're doing the work of church teaching and church doctrine. There are other things the Catholic Church does, many of which should be covered much, much more and have a lot more to do immediately with, one could argue, with the lives of Catholics, right?
Well,
but I mean, what we see here is an example of how is theology covered? And most Americans and most human beings, I think, are atheological. It's not what interests them. Now, I'm a bit odd in that I find it interesting, but I'm also under no illusion that most people do, and I don't think most people, when they perform their religious observance, are acting out of theological impulses. So I think that the media is almost always bound to get that wrong, because most reporters, being human beings, don't care that much about that particular thing.
Well, I disagree with Rod that the media isn't interested in what Pope Francis says about the poor. I think the media is very interested in that. And I think they're very interested every time he does something that steps outside talking about issues of sex and sexuality. I think the media finds that really interesting. I think the media finds it very interesting that what Francis says flies in the face of, Tea Party economics. So I think that has gotten a lot of coverage, and I think that there hasn't been a lot of depth to the coverage, but there has been a lot of coverage. And the synod, I think, is it was called an extraordinary synod, right? So I think just that terminology, the knowledge that there hasn't been one since 1980, and that this was a really important thing for Catholics, even though nothing was finalized until next year when they meet again. I think that that's what fueled the interest in it, and it was, by design, that it was to talk about issues of marriage and divorce and family life. And, you call it extraordinary, and you say you're going to talk about possibly changing something like, divorced and remarried people receiving communion. And I think people are going to pay attention. I think that that's why that got so much attention, whether the coverage was good or not.
You know what, Mark talks about how there's this atheology in the American public, and I think you're really onto something. I used to be a columnist at the New York Post. This was about 15 years ago. I came to my editor one morning and proposed doing something about some evangelicals in Queens where had something going on, and I thought it was worthy of a column, and he said no, and he looked at me and said that in effect, the only way religion matters in this city is because of what it has to do with politics. So at that time, the coverage of religion that New York Post gave was when Cardinal O'Connor said something controversial or a Jewish leader said something that affected the political life of the city. I thought that's really interesting because I lived in the same neighborhood as this particular editor who's no longer at the paper. We both went to the same subway stop in the morning. We both had to walk past one synagogue, one mosque, an Episcopal church, two Catholic churches, and a storefront Pentecostal church, yet he didn't see them. I saw them because I'm a religious person. And I thought that when you have people like that making the calls, all these evangelicals in Queens are invisible to the New York Post at that time, anyway.
I mean, I've certainly had, my one version of that is when I've written in the past about ultra-Orthodox Jews, trying to explain to people, whether they be fellow journalists or editors or readers, that not all ultra-Orthodox Jews are Hasidic Jews, that they are not synonyms. I mean, and you'll see it in the comments of my piece last weekend, where the commenters just start right in with, well, these Hasidim and these Hasidim, and these people are not Hasidim. They're just not. And, but and you get the questions like, well, why don't these guys have beards? Aren't they all supposed to have beards? I mean, the ignorance the shallowness runs deep.
I want to just follow up on this point we all agree is very important, that this country, compared to other Western liberal democracies, is clearly the most religious and at the same time the least theological. And I think there's probably a relationship. We can be so religious because we don't kill over theology. But given that we've got so many theologians in the room, let alone Jesuits who have a particular interest in the Pope, what's cause and effect here? Is there less coverage of theology because we just don't have theologians of the stature of a Reinhold Niebuhr or any of the theologians
Wait,
that
Alan,
used to be featured in the cover of Time magazine?
Do other countries cover theology really well?
Hmm?
Do other countries cover theology? Does the Times of London cover theology well?
German newspapers, absolutely.
I don't read enough German newspapers. I mean, I'm sure you're right. It's not my, speaking of the Anglophone media, it's not my perception that England and Ireland and let's say France, which I'm a little familiar with, cover theology particularly well at all. But maybe they do. And it's interesting that the German media does, which makes a certain sense, actually.
So why, you're asking
I'm asking why?
Why American media don't
Yeah,
cover
is it
theology
because
at
there
all,
are
or
less?
well?
Is it because there are less interesting theologians than there were a generation
No.
ago, or is it because the lack of interest in theology just simply neglects a rich theological tradition that currently exists in the United States but isn't getting broader public attention.
I'm gonna float a theory that I'm just thinking of as we're talking. But I think that, there used to be people of a certain stature that were the go-to person for something or another. I think that that's become more diffuse. We don't have a Niebuhr. I don't know, maybe there is somebody, why wouldn't Martin Marty be the go-to person for that? I'm not sure.
Cornel West?
But I have another.
Please, no.
I have another theory, and that is that over the 20th century, religion and particularly Christianity became like there was a lot more sort of do-it-yourself, like the storefront or the televangelist or the radio preacher, and I think that just created all these religious leaders and religious figures who are not necessarily serious theologians. So, you may have a televangelist who's extremely well known and extremely popular, and so that's why you might see Joel Osteen on CNN instead of Martin Marty. I'm just throwing out examples. It's just a theory. I don't know.
But what happens, Sarah, if Joel Osteen speaks for more people? And that's the thing that disturbs me as someone who's serious about his religion. You can call all the academics you want who take it seriously, but if we're only talking to each other and not we're not representing where the people are, I think that's a problem.
I think the question is why is that where the people are? That's a question that needs to be interrogated by journalists or historians or even theologians. It is, he's where the people are in part because it's easy and it's fun and it's accessible. And I think, I've spent a lot of time reporting about televangelists, so I feel like I understand what draws people to them, and it's that it makes them feel good about themselves, and it makes them feel like they have a role in the world, and even though they're, not themselves somebody who has some big important job, they have a big role in the world, and God has blessed them, and I think that that's something that's very appealing to people, and whether it's serious theology or not, in a way it doesn't matter. The marketing has accomplished something that stands outside theology.
I love theology, but I don't think we need more reporting on it. I think that in fact, so priests accepted. Could I see a show of hands in the room for the people for whom theology is important to how you lead your life? Wow, okay, we're at Boston College. So that just so you guys need more reporting about theology. But honestly, you're exceptional. Would you agree with me about that?
I think you're right.
It's not what my readers want to read about. It's not how they lead their lives.
Disagrees.
It's not how their ministers lead their lives, frankly. It's not how most seminarians.
So make it interesting.
It's not how. It's not how. Who cares? I love theology, but I don't see it as some sort of intrinsic good. And I think that.
So you're writing about what you think your readers want to hear you.
No, I'm not. I'm just. Is there some reason we should be spoon feeding the medicine of theology to people who don't lead their lives theologically, who aren't interested in it, and who don't respond to it?
Well, Mark, I think that
and what's more, 50 years ago, I don't think most people cared about it then. The reason they called Reinhold Niebuhr for a quotation is because journalism did a worse job. And so certain, white men were lifted up as profound, and they got a lot of phone calls from reporters, and they were easy for Flax to sell to journalists. But that was probably irresponsible. I love Niebuhr, but that was probably irresponsible of the media then. So I don't see that as a golden age.
I think that, to use a cliche, ideas have consequences, and I think that even though the man and woman in the pew may not know who the primary theological figures within their traditions are, the pastors and the leaders are being trained somewhere. I think that this could be a problem not of journalism, but of theology, of pastoral theology in this country, that perhaps the new generation of pastors who are being trained and rabbis are not being taught or do not think it's important to bring the basic ideas of the religion to the people. I don't know. What do you all think?
We'll turn that to the audience. Why don't we do that? I was going to say that the third major topic that was introduced in the beginning was the Middle East thing, and Sarah was talking briefly about that. I'm plunging into that territory next Tuesday when a book I've written is being published called At Home in Exile, Why Diaspora is Good for the Jews. And although I sort of say over and over again in the book, I'm actually not writing about Israel. I'm writing about where the other Jews in the world live in the diaspora. Boy, I'm trying to protect myself in advance. But if I heard you say that you got a lot of compliments when you started writing, then that's very reassuring. But we don't need to talk about that. We want to hear from you.
Hi, this is great, and thank you all for being here.
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, my name's Steve Salamone. I'm actually a teacher at Boston College High School, theology teacher, so that's why I raised my hand. But Rod, I'm a longtime reader of your blog, and I have a ton of questions, but one of the ones that I'm thinking of is, as a journalist, the fact that when you blog, it's very obvious to me that you have relationships with longtime readers, people who comment all the time. Many of them seem to know each other, and there's this community that's formed online. And I find myself in many ways, and I don't know if I'm happy about this or not happy about it, but like sometimes I feel like my parish is online or
Isn't that
something. That
interesting?
the people who I feel most comfortable around as a Catholic or as a Christian are essentially strangers, but they have some sort of personality in my head, and it comes through on their comments and stuff. So I was just wondering, I do think you do a really good job of fostering that, and I really love reading people with whom I disagree on your blogs. I guess my question is, number one, how do you actually foster that specifically? What are the mechanics of it? And number two, how does that influence your calling as a journalist? The fact that there's almost like a real-time conversation happening.
Right. Thank you for those questions. The main thing I do to foster that sense of community, and you're right, that some of these people, I don't even know their real names. They've been commenting for years, and I know who they are. I know what their struggles are. And it's odd, this sense of community we have, even though we've never met. I will not let people write when they personally attack somebody. I take it down. People who read my blog can't see what doesn't go up. But I've had to do that more in years past. Usually the trolls go away and we don't have to deal with them anymore. But every week I ban 2 or 3 people because they come on and they just say nasty things about others, and I won't let that comment go up. Your second question,
I was just, as a journalist, you know, you had mentioned print journalism being a little more dispassionate.
Right.
You know, with the future of journalism moving more and more to the digital, and also that allows like real-time or almost real-time conversations with readers. How does that influence your writing?
Because on a blog, and I've been doing this for so long, I just get used to it. Whenever there's a breaking news story, if I have an opinion on it, I'll go up with the opinion, and I'll revise the opinion once more information comes available, or readers say, hey, you're wrong about this, and I'll go back and say I was wrong. Because I think that's important for credibility. I don't feel like that I think that my credibility with my readers depends on me being able to admit that I'm wrong, because honestly, the way I approach my job is I don't see myself as carrying a torch for one side or the other. People know what my commitments are. I'm an Orthodox Christian. They know where I stand on most things, but they also know, I hope, that I'm really more interested in them as people, and how do we talk about these issues together as a community. And I think that as a journalist, it's problematic because what people like Mark and Sarah do, you know, it requires having to go, you know, fact check and wait until you don't have to respond right away. I feel like to be a blogger, you do need to respond right away, but you do have the luxury of going back and revising your opinion. And I try to do that when I've learned I'm wrong or the story has changed. And I think that's one reason I have readers who don't agree with me theologically, but they keep coming back and say, no, I'm trying to keep it honest, and they keep me honest.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good discussion. My name is Ben Burnbaum. I work here at Boston College. And I do a lot of writing for the university and edit the alumni magazine, and do marketing and so on. My question is this. I was raised Orthodox, not ultra, but Orthodox and not Hasidic. Thanks for pointing that out. I was connected with the Lakeview community you wrote about. But, and then I've spent 35 years at a Catholic college trying to interpret that for Catholics and for non-Catholics. And I will say that my dear Catholic friends at Boston College have no more notion of Judaism than I had of Catholicism before I got my ABD here, so to speak. And my Jewish family and Jewish friends have no more notion of Catholicism. I'm sorry, they have no more notion of Judaism. My Jewish friends have no more notion of Catholicism. And they read each other. I'm privileged to have a foot in both camps, at least intellectually. And they read each other passing by, you know, on the highway. There is not, so when someone writes in the New York Times, Lori Goodstein writes something about Catholicism, my Catholic friends here react in one way, and my Jewish friends down the street react in an entirely other way. And I think you guys do a wonderful job. I admire all four of you. I admire your writing, but I think you have an impossible job. I don't know how you can cross those kinds of bridges journalistically in a way that, in the end, is sound. So that's my comment. I'd like to know what you think. You're not
And-
like a guy who writes sports.
Right.
Anymore, is my point.
Well, the big difference is, right, the only people who read the sports reporter are people who care about the sport. Right? That's the way I'm not, right? And I think that I presume I'm writing about religion for people who are interested in the stories that I have to tell about religion, but they will read them differently, and depending on what tradition they come from, or most commonly from no real thick tradition at all. But I don't let that trouble me. In other words, I don't see the job as being some sort of as running group therapy for American interfaith dialogue. Like that's not what I do. I report on stories, and sometimes in other venues, as a freelancer, I pontificate or offer opinions or whatever. But I don't ever imagine that I'm helping to heal anything, except perhaps in some greater sense that I think that well-written stuff that tells true stories is to the good in the world, not the bad.
I think as a journalist, my best efforts at reporting on a religious community that I am not familiar with from my own personal experience have been most successful when I immerse myself in it and spend a lot of time in that community and a lot of time talking to the people in that community. So, you know, I think that for anybody, you know, this is true, maybe not as true for non-religion beats. You know, like when you're not familiar with a certain community, your writing is going to have a certain, you know, it's not going to ring for someone who's familiar with that community, if you know what I mean. And so having the opportunity to be in an immersion situation or an immersion setting in those communities is invaluable for journalists. And I can think of a couple of instances where I've done that. I immersed myself in a Messianic Jewish community in Israel, which was, you know, very much outside my frame of reference because I am Jewish, and these are people who identify as Jews but believe Jesus is the Messiah. And, you know, I don't know that they were happy with what I wrote, but that's not my purpose. My purpose is to illuminate this community for my readers, shed light on it, you know, describe it, and have them see what it looks like from the inside. So, yeah, I mean, I think that maybe people feel more strongly about it when it's religion, right? But I think that whenever a reporter writes about a community that the reporter isn't that familiar with, it's going to seem a little hollow to people who are intimately familiar with it. But I think people feel more strongly about it when it's religion.
Sarah, I think you.
Ben, in response to your question, I don't think it's an impossible job. I just think it's an enormously difficult one. When I started writing about, you know, in general, the sociology of religion, every book I read by an academic was about their own. And that really bothered me, and so I decided the last thing in the world I wanted to do was to write about my own. But then you get into all kinds of crazy. I wrote a book, The Transformation of American Religion, essentially documenting this more therapeutic side of Christianity, and I discovered that the people who loved the book most were the really, really strongly conservative Christians who also thought that their fellow Christians were too soft. And I found myself being praised, and by Cal Thomas and by Al Mohler of the Southern Baptist, and it was just really a weird experience. It's like they knew in some way that there was that the real toughness of the religion was being dissipated, but when a secular Jew teaching at a Catholic college said it, then it must be true, and that kind of makes you feel. But it's also difficult to, it's difficult to write about your own. It's difficult to cross over and write about another. It's just you're absolutely right. It's really hard.
It was on that point, Alan, it was funny when I was a conservative Catholic criticizing the bishops writing about the abuse scandal for National Review and otherwise, a lot of the conservative Catholics were like, right on, give it to them, give it to them. When I left the Catholic Church writing the same things, suddenly I was the traitor. I was writing the same things, but it was all how it was received.
But let me also say to your point, Ben, I don't think interreligious understanding is that important. It's not only that it's not my job, I don't think it matters that much. I mean, the American experiment is that we have to be decent and kind to each other and do our best despite our ignorance. And the ignorance isn't just between religious Jews and Jesuits. I mean, the ignorance is between members of the United Methodist Church and members of the Presbyterian Church USA. I mean, two people walk into Protestant churches, they don't know their own traditions, they don't know each other's. But they're good to each other, their kids intermarry, they can vacation together, they can gamble together, they can download porn together, all those American things. And that's the experiment. I'm not troubled by the horrible religious ignorance all around me, even though I love absorbing religious knowledge personally.
I have found, Mark, on that point, that the things I've written about on my blog that have meant the most to my readers across the board have not been discussions of theology or finer points of theology, but have been storytelling. I tracked my sister, Ruthie, got cancer, lung cancer. She was 40 years old when she was diagnosed a few years ago. And I saw an amazing religion story happening in my hometown, even though I was living in Philadelphia, but trying to cover it from there, about the way this community of our little hometown came together to help that family, my sister's family. And the way she died was a profoundly religious event. My sister did not care this much about theology. She went to church, but as you say, she didn't care about it. But those people in that town lived the Christian faith in a way that was new to me, so caught up in my head. And I found on my blog, Steve, maybe you've seen the same thing, that when you tell stories about people, whether they're religiously liberal, conservative, whatever, the stories, that's what gets down into the hearts of readers, and that's what really engages readers.
We have a question from Twitter. You're gonna, and then I can go over there.
This question actually comes from Kimberly Winston of the Religion News Service in California. I think this goes to something that Sarah was saying in her opening statements. You were talking about how you need to give credence to other people's religious claims. But is it really about giving credence or respect? Because she says those are two different things, and sort of how do you balance that?
Okay, so credence to a religious claim about, what I meant was credence to a claim that this is what my religion states. My religion states that the use of contraception is a moral evil. Okay, I give credence to that. I believe you that that's what your religion states. So that's what I mean, like taking that claim seriously. That's part, I mean, obviously, like you could take that to something more theoretical, like I believe in God. Well, and I give credence to that, but I see what she's saying, but it's not my purpose to unpack that. It's just to be like, okay, yes, that is part of your belief system. I get it.
Thank you. My name is Ellen Kittle. I work for the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts in communications. And we've been in the news a bit lately, just with leadership changes. And as you know, a lot of papers don't have a dedicated religious staff. I think the Globe has maybe one or two dedicated religion reporters. And as a communications professional, I've been sort of frustrated with the accuracy that we've received from those reporters in a few things lately. And I was just wondering if you had any advice to institutions on like providing context and I guess welcome to reporters who may not be the types of experts that you are.
Can you repeat where you were? I didn't get it.
The Episcopal Diocese of
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Well, I can tell you from my time at the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News is that we always heard from religious people in the community when we were doing something wrong. They never called to say, thank you for doing something right. And I would go out into the community and meet people who knew I was religiously sympathetic with them, and they would complain about the bias of the newspaper on this, that, et cetera. So, well, have you talked to the reporter? Well, no. If you're not talking to the reporter, why aren't you talking to the reporter? I think people who do what you do need to develop personal relationships with reporters, and I think too many people on your side see the reporters as the enemy. Again, my experience is mainly with conservative religious churches and religious people. They see the media as the enemy and assume bad faith when bad faith really isn't there. And if they developed a good relationship with the reporter, it doesn't mean they're going to get good press all the time, but it means that they will be able, when something breaks about your church or nationally or locally, you can pick the phone up, the reporter will take your call, or you take the reporter's call, and I think that's just a better way to get things done. I mean,
Well, I don't expect PR folks to tell me when I'm doing things right. Like, that is not an expectation that I have at all, nor do I want that. But I am very interested in accuracy, and so when somebody gets in touch with me and says, I really think you got XYZ wrong, I want to listen to what they have to say. I think most reporters, will listen to that. Most reporters are interested in accuracy. And it may not rise to the level of requiring a correction, because it may be a matter of, you weren't completely happy with the way something was described, but it's not necessarily necessitating a correction. But I think opening up a dialogue with a reporter, I think most reporters are receptive to that. I would be.
I like it. Oh.
Yeah. I think like what Rod said is, be in communication with the reporter who covers whatever you're doing. And, I've gotten emails from people who do PR and say, that says basically, do you know we're here, and can I introduce you to so-and-so? And if you'd ever need to talk to so-and-so or get comment from so-and-so, I'm happy to help, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I really like a lot of the PR people who reach out to me. I like the ones most who know what they're talking about. So this is actually, religion is good for that. A lot of times the person who does communications for the Episcopal Diocese is a pretty devout Episcopalian. And that's always great, because then I can say, well, why don't we have coffee? I'm not going to write about that story you pitched me. It sounds boring. But let's meet, and we'll talk about church polity and, the history of Anglicanism, and then we'll know each other. So when you have and I'll tell you the kind of things I am looking for. Every reporter's nightmare is the PR person who's just like a hired gun, who doesn't have it, who just is a freelancer, who, is pitching like Cabbage Patch Kids one day and Three Musketeers bar the next, and then, Presbyterianism the next, and so that's bad.
And you can't lie. Whatever you do,
Yeah.
don't lie. Because in Dallas, under a couple of bishops ago, they had a spokesman, and Dallas was hit with the Diocese of Dallas was hit with a lot of sex abuse stories and lawsuits. The spokesman had no credibility with the local media because he was seen, fairly or not, he was seen as trying to spin all the time. And that's deadly for the church, because you can't have that bad relationship. If you don't know the answer to something, say you don't know, or you can't say, but once you lose credibility in the eyes of the reporter, it's very, very hard to get back. And I'll say one more thing, too. I used to be a film critic at the New York Post in the late 90s. Miramax Films, which, are they even around anymore?
It's the Weinstein
Harvey
company
Weinstein,
now, right?
yeah. Anyway, they were, without a doubt, the best publicist of all the film publicists, because they developed that relationship, and every one of their phone calls wasn't about, this is the best thing ever. I came to trust them, saying that we know what your tastes are, we know what you're interested in. This film is something that I think really is going to mean a lot to you. And I would take them seriously, because all their competitors were like, this film is the best thing ever. I felt like I was talking to a real person, not a publicity machine. That's secular stuff, but I think that there's a lot of public relations wisdom in that.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to. I'm sorry?
Identify yourself.
Right. My name's Connor Wood. I'm at BU doing a PhD in religion, and I wanted to speak to the question of the usefulness of theology and teaching about it. It seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of bad theology in American culture at large right now, and that insight into the traditions of theology might have prevented people from buying some of the lame theology that, if sorry to disagree with anybody here, that George Bush used to initiate wars. I had a great thing all lined up in my head with a bunch of things, and so I was driving around Wisconsin the other day with my stepdad, and he is a secular person his whole life, has no religious training. He asked me something about the Puritans, and it developed into a deep conversation about Calvinist theology. And he was so into it because it illuminated a ton about American culture. Like, you really cannot understand a lot about the United States if you don't understand Calvinist theology. And so the idea that it doesn't matter whether we know theology or that it's not our jobs as religion writers, I write a blog, that to help people understand the differences and distinctions that really matter in theology, I guess I would just disagree.
Nobody writes about theology more for the times than I do. I obviously love it. And look, Stephen Prothero, who wrote Religious Illiteracy, he agrees with you, right? And I said in my review of his book, I said, so one of his claims, and by the way, I've never met him, but he's been a lovely correspondent. I think he's a very good scholar, but I disagreed with a principal claim of his book. He said, and I'm obviously paraphrasing many years after the fact, he said something to the effect of, like, maybe if we understood differences in the culture wars better, they wouldn't be as fierce. Actually, the opposite could be true. They could be fiercer and bloodier. Like, we don't know. But I don't see mutual understanding as sort of as a pacifying effect that way. Now, is it interesting
But
and
what
good?
about historical understanding?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, we understand lots of people whom we continue to loathe. I just don't see it as necessarily true.
Oh, no, but he's not saying that we would,
What?
whether it leads to somebody loathing or loving someone, it's just a matter of understanding our
Understanding.
context.
Yes, understanding leads to understanding. Like, I see that as a truism, right? And I think it's intellectually interesting and personally fulfilling to know more about the Puritan heritage, right? Like, I can see why that's enriching to one's life as it's enriching to mine. I just don't make any claims for sort of political amelioration coming out of it.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
No, I don't think anybody was, though. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm working on a book right now about Dante and the Divine Comedy and how it changed my life reading it in a period of depression. And the thing that amazed me so much about the Divine Comedy was a lot of this stuff I knew from a theological point of view. But Dante made it come alive in my moral imagination and made it accessible to me in a way that deeply affected me in a positive way and helped me out of a very dark hole, a very dark wood. And I was writing just yesterday one of the chapters, and I had to, about the Inferno, and this is a chapter when Dante and Virgil go through the circle of the sodomites. That's the word he uses. It's not a canto about homosexuality. They barely mention it at all. They end up talking with Brunetto Latini, who was his mentor, and it's about art and fruitful creation of art. And I had to, when I'm writing the book, was trying to explain to the readers, like, I know what you're thinking, but this is not what you think. And if you go into Dante, if you go and talk about that canto from the point of view of art and what Dante's saying about art, it provides a back door through which you can talk about the meaning of generativity in human beings. Now, that sounds so high-flown but for me, it was a way of understanding better the whole natural law question that is at the center of a lot of what we argue about when we argue about theology of sexuality. I got to it through reading this really interesting canto in Dante. I think that if we could find a way to have better art and better storytelling that illustrates these theological principles, we might get a lot farther in helping the average person understand them.
Here's how I propose that we end this terrific discussion, because we're going to have to do that. But we have a few minutes more. I'd like to ask each of you, if you didn't have to worry about an editor, or if you're a blogger, if you didn't have to worry about how many comments you're going to generate. Just up to you. What do you think is the single most underreported aspect of religion in the United States that needs the attention that a really top-rate journalist, and you're all top-rate journalists, should write about? And we can start and go this way.
Start with me.
Good.
Oh, no, no. Start.
Well, I mean, I'll go back to the Islam issue. I really think that Americans do not understand Islam. They do not understand its connection with Judaism and Christianity, how much it shares in common with Judaism and Christianity. I didn't say that in a kumbaya way. I'm just saying, just as a matter of fact. And the variety of Muslims that we have in the United States, that they're not predominantly from Arab countries, that many of them are African American, many of them from Asia, and that their lived religion varies. And I think that there are some really good reporters. Andrea Elliott of the New York Times has done some great reporting on this. I think it's a very difficult thing to penetrate in a single story, and impossible to penetrate it as a whole in a single story. So it just requires more attention, and in a way that I think is difficult for people to get outside their comfort zone. Not because it's controversial, but just because it would be really difficult reporting work to do.
Mark, you have the second last
Sure.
word.
Let me speak not to one topic, but a kind of journalism we need, which I think will answer your question in a meaningful way. Because, as Sarah points out, it's so hard to get inside communities, any community, especially when one is from outside that community or doesn't have the necessary languages or the ethnicity that people in it might be comfortable with, right? We need...
Or gender.
Or gender, or class status, or all sorts of things, right? We need more indigenous reporting that's hard-hitting and good and smart and critical and not reverent and not kumbaya. And right now, so we need the ethnic media and the religious media to be less about PR and more about journalism or hard-hitting and intelligent and thoughtful opinion writing. So I was on a panel at Northeastern the other night called On the Jewish Media, which sounds like some sort of anti-Semites fantasy panel, right? But it was hosted by Brooke Gladstone, who hosts On the Media, so they just put in a caret with On the Jewish Media. And one of the things I said was the way that Tablet and the foreword to Jewish publications for which, full disclosure, I've worked, the way that they think it's terrific to break scandals within the Jewish community. I mean, that's like their happiest day is when they can find something true and harmful to the community to report, whether it's sex abuse at Yeshiva University or something new and controversial to say about the Middle East. That's great, not just because it drives traffic, but because self-scrutiny is so important to the mission. You'll see that a little bit in the National Catholic. You'll see it in the National Catholic Reporter. You'll see it to some extent in Commonweal. You will see it scarcely in an evangelical magazine like World, but not as much in Christianity Today. But basically, once you get outside the Jewish community, it's just failure after failure. I mean, nobody does it the way that the Forward and Tablet do it to Jews. There is no Muslim American publication that's interested in puncturing Muslim self-respect in a useful way, in the way that the Forward is for Jews. And we just need more of that. And it'll come with time, and it'll come with those communities' self-confidence. But it's not there yet, and it's necessary.
World has written scathing stories on Dinesh D'Souza,
Yeah, no, I said
Ralph
World.
Reed, and right. Okay, so
I
thought
said
you were
World.
reading-
No,
yeah,
Marvin
yeah.
Olasky's
Yeah.
magazine World is the best of that in the
Right,
Protestant
that's right.
community.
I think there are two stories. On an international point of view, the growing divide in religious understanding between the West and the rest of the world. I think this is going to be a major issue in the Catholic Church in the next 20, 30, 40 years as we grow more and more secular in the West and Africa and the global South becomes more and more religiously fervent. I think that there's just a gulf of understanding there that is going to be more important for the media to help we in the West understand how the rest of them see the world, see religion and see the world. I think in our country, one of the great unreported stories is the falling away of the working class from religion. Religion, the practice of religion has become more and more a middle-class thing for middle-class educated people. And why is that? And what does that mean for our country and the future of our country? What does it mean for social issues? What does it mean for social cohesion? I think this is something that we don't really touch on. And I notice that most of the people I know, like I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, most of the converts to Orthodoxy are middle-class educated people. Most of the people I talk to about religion, Jewish, Christian, whatever, middle-class educated people. And they go to church with middle-class educated people. What does that say about the rest of America and the future of America when the church and the synagogue are not talking to the working classes?
Well, as I said in opening the event, I had really high expectations for this evening, and they've been more than fulfilled. We've ranged from very practical matters as to how to deal with public relations to matters of high theology. I just think it's been a fabulous, fabulous discussion. Thank you all so much, and I hope you all agree with me and will express it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Alan.